Our next speaker here on Stream 1 is Dr. John Leys. He's worked for 40 years as a soil conservationist. He has positions with Australian National University, the CSIRO, and the Department of Planning, Industry and Environment in New South Wales. His research and extension interests are in the area of wind erosion, dust storms, impacts and ground cover, and how land management can reduce soil erosion. The title of his topic today is "Was 2019-2020 the dustiest year since 44-45 in New South Wales?" And it's got nothing to do with how well you clean your house. Please welcome Dr. John Leys.
Good morning and thank you very much. I too wish I was in Longreach. I spent about a decade working on Diamantina Lakes down there on the Diamantina, so I was looking forward to coming back and catching up with some people. But unfortunately, because I'm broadcasting from Canada and New South Wales, that's not quite possible. So this question I'm asking today comes out of regular inquiries that we get from the media about, was this the biggest dust storm and is it the worst? So first of all, I'd like to acknowledge the Dust Watch and the Rural Air Quality in New South Wales. We set this up some 15 years ago to try and engage the community as well as gather some scientific information. We've got to thank the Bureau of Meteorology, because you'll see from their efforts, we have data which goes back nearly 80 years. I'd like to thank Tig and Matt, who have helped with providing me with historical data and visibility data we've got from previous papers, and especially the Dust Watch volunteers and other volunteers who help us out. Without people on the ground looking after our equipment and telling us what's going on, we really just would have far less idea of what's going on in the landscape. So dust storms. I got interested in them as a soil conservationist because I thought it was a good indicator of how we were performing at looking after the land. And when I began work in 1982, obviously it was the middle of a drought. I was in hay. I put out a rain gauge because I was a hydrologist. And unfortunately, my rain gauge filled up with dust. So I asked the question, where did the dust come from? And for 40 years, I've been chasing those dust storms. The reason I got really interested was mainly because the on-site impacts. As a soil conservationist, we'd visit people, talk to them about land management practices. And this picture here, taken in 2002, you can see there's quite a bit of soil loss, probably about 1 centimetre. That contrasts with this photograph taken in the Mallee, probably in the 1940s, where there's probably about 2 metres. The original ground level would have been up here. These are the roots of the Mallee tree. And of course, when soil gets moved around in the landscape, it gets deposited. In this particular case, we can see it's all been piled up in these stockyards on the hay plain, not an ideal place to keep your soil. When the soil erosion takes place, it also emits dust. And then when that dust travels, it travels long ways. So in 2002, there was a large dust storm in October that got into Sydney. 2009, the Red Dawn event. This event was just enormous, the biggest one we've measured since 1940s, and it had a huge impact on the economy of New South Wales. $300 million we estimate they lost for that 24 hours caused by this dust storm. Most for doing cleaning, just like Nicole said. It's one of the big costs associated with dust storms in urban areas. So to the question, the media asked, are dust storms getting better? Are they getting worse? Was this the biggest dust storm in which we had? There was a large dust storm that hit Sydney in February 2019. And everyone, I think, remembers the dust and the smoke that occurred at the end of 19 and early 20. So first of all, what is a dust storm? So the World Meteorological Association has this definition: if you can see 1,000, if you can't see 1,000 meters or less, you're in a dust storm. It's been used as a indicator for many years. Andrew Gowdy started this working up in the Northwest in the Kimberley, looking at dust events back in 1983. We also know that when you're inside one of these dust storms, anyone who's been in one, you know it's hard to breathe, and that's because there's all this dust in the air. So we measure how much is in the air in micrograms per cubic meter through the air quality system, and I'll explain about that a bit later, why we've chosen that number. So in the study, how do we assess which is the biggest dust storm year? Well, we need to define our dust storm, so we now have that. We need a time series And obviously dust storms in Australia tend to occur in the biggest droughts. So we looked at the World War II drought. 1944-45 was the dustiest year in that drought period. We looked at the millennial drought. 2009-2010 was the biggest dust storm. This is the Red Dawn event. And 2019-20 was the biggest dust year in the recent 2017 to 20 drought. And you can see the dust blowing off the coast here and even over the top of the cloud. So the big challenge for studies like this is interdecadal monitoring. Now, the Bureau of Meteorology has had observers looking out the window every 3, 6, or 12 hours for the last 80 years, and they've been writing down what they see. And they've coded those as dust events, thunderstorms, rain events. However, about 2010, the Bureau decided they would go to automatic weather stations. So they've retired a number of the observers, and now we just have nephelometers to measure dust, but they're mainly at the large airports. So what this meant was that we could see in the mid-noughties that there was going to be a decline in the number of observations. That's when we set up DustWatch. You think we might be able to use satellite imagery, but there are spatial scales and temporal scale issues. We like to know where the dust comes from right down to the paddock scale, and we also would like to know these questions about how is it trending through time. So we have a special interest in long-term data. Satellite imagery doesn't go back that far, and we have a big problem in Australia, as seen from the previous slide, that cloud tends to be associated, so it hides the dust. Modelling is okay, but it's got temporal and spatial scale issues, and it generally relies on satellite data input, especially from the ground cover point of view. So that doesn't go back very far either. Air quality measurements, as I said, DustWatch was set up about 15 years ago. So in New South Wales, we have pretty good data. It's 1 minute data. It's measured by these little devices, which our volunteers look up after. But it has spatial limitations. So I guess the story here is nothing's perfect, but we are going to use the Bureau of Meteorological data, and we're going to use the air quality data today. So the BOM data we're going to use for the World War II and the millennial droughts. And what the BOM data is, they count the number of days. We're going to count the number of days when the observers say they saw a dust storm. Now, back in 1940s, we had about 12 stations within New South Wales. There was about 53 stations across New South Wales, across Australia, but 12 were in New South Wales. We're going to use the DustWatch data from the millennial and the 2017-20 drought period. And for that, we're using these PM10. It's the particulate matter less than, and we're going to derive a relationship, how much PM10 is there when you can see 1 kilometre. To the weather codes. So these are the internationally recognised World Meteorological Association codes. There's over 100 of them, but these are the dusty ones. And so we're in the red box. And they all have this definition of being able to have visibility less than 1 kilometre, except with the number 98. It has a thunderstorm, a dust or sandstorm. But as I said, the limitation of this data is that in 2010, the observers started making less and less observations. So this is what the data looks like. There's a count of the number of dust events. This is from Tighe's paper. It's all the dust events, including all the dust hazes. But you can see there's this monthly sort of cyclic picture about what goes on. But this is the very important data that we'll be using in this study. The 2009-10 data, plus if this graph went back far enough, it would go back to 1940s. The other data is the rural air quality data from the TPIE in New South Wales. This is their current location. We have about 40 of these instruments providing information. The data is published every hour and it's on the web. It comes in this form of the local, the closest town, and then the particulate matter less than 2.5 microns and 10 microns. We're looking at this 10 micron bunch. And you can see at this particular day, Euston was the highest dust emission on the record. These are the study sites. Now, this is where things start to get interesting because the DustWatch sites, you can see we've got 20 of them and they're widely distributed around Western New South Wales. The Bureau data in 1944 and 2010 we had to use the 44 ones as the base data so we could be comparable. And basically you can see there are all the airports along the coast, airports down here in Riverina and also Broken Hill. So what the Dustwatch data has, it does two things. It sees more places and it sees data on a continuous basis. It's a minute observations, as the bureaus were 3 hourly observations. This has implications. The second thing we had to do was convert the dust concentrations to a visibility. So this is work from Baddock that we did previously, and we've been able to come up with this relationship that around 240 microns, you can see about 1K. So that's how we convert the dust concentration to visibility to dust storms. The results. 1945, if we average the 12 sites across New South Wales, there's about 5.8 dust storms observed. If we look in 2009, there was about 0.6. So it's about a 10-fold difference between these two periods. We then look at the Dustwatch data. We saw about 5 on average across the 20 sites, and it was about twice as many in 2011. In 2019-20. So it's about a 4.4-fold difference between 1945 and 2019-20. So the obvious answer is that there was far, far more dust and dust events in the 1940s. But why? Why was it so much dusty? So the State of the Environment report back in 2011, we went back and had a look at land management practices that were being published. And we basically found that the causes of the erosion seemed to be around the widespread land settlement on small blocks. They had no drought assistance. The farming rotations in the Mallee were in particular around multiple cultivations and crops. The big thing they had was rabbits. A lot of these Met stations were at railheads and on towns, commons and airports, and they tended to be overgrazed. There's an inability to move stock around, and there was massive overgrazing of the stock routes. There were huge stock losses in the 1940s. There was also not very many people in the landscape. With the war too, there was really a depopulation, and people to manage the land, and we know how much time and effort it takes, weren't available, and that's why it was also a contributing factor. The outcome of all the 1940s was in New South Wales with the establishment of the Soil Conservation Service because of the widespread degradation. If we have a look at what's happening now in the noughties, we've got widespread amalgamation of properties. Bigger properties tend to have more resources and therefore are able to manage things better. We have drought assistance. We've got conservation farming methods, which are leading to more ground cover. Rabbits are largely controlled. We've got goats and camel issues, but rabbits are probably the big one. Total grazing pressure is much better managed with better watering and fencing. Our commons and railheads have now been revegetated. If anyone's been to Cobar or Broken Hill and had a look at their commons, you'll know what I'm talking about. We can move stock around because we've got better roads and better means. And we have lots of policies, including Land Care and Native Vegetation Acts. All these things we believe are contributing to the mitigation of the dust noughties, even though we know the climate is much more intense. But it's about measuring ground cover from space. The New South Wales in the 2019 average for the entire 12 months, and this is 1920. And the big difference is in the far west of the state, there was about 79% of New South was protected from wind erosion, i.e. it had more than 50%, so 50 to 100% ground cover. It changed in 2020. You can see there's a larger area opening up here in the central wheat belt and in the northern floodplains. So if you look at the difference map, it really shows that there was up to 20 to 30% less cover, especially in this northern area, and this is really a huge area which contributed to the dust storms. As the previous slide shows, we went from 79% protected to 69%. That 10% looks like it resulted in twice as much dust being emitted. So in conclusion, the challenge for these sort of studies and all monitoring programs is to have long time series data. And because we know things change through time, is being able to make the time series comparable. So we've used dust storm days as our comparable measure using 2 different data sets. We did it with the MET codes. Thank heavens that the Bureau has kept this data and has made it publicly available. So we've got this weather code data going back to the 1940s. And the Dustwatch data now is continuous. But unfortunately, Dustwatch is a New South Wales-centric program. And unfortunately, we don't know what's going on the rest of the continent to the same degree. But at least in this study, we're able to do that 80-year time series. What we found was the count of the dust storm days, there was about 4.5 times more dust. Land management has improved and it seems to be suppressing dust storms, and that's fantastic news because we know the climate is getting harder and harder to manage. So it's really important that we can see improvements even though the climate's becoming more difficult. And this 10% reduction seemed to have a huge impact on the amount of dust emission within New South Wales. I'd like to thank you, and please put your questions in the chat and we can talk about it at the end of the program. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Dr. John Leys, for that presentation. And it's good to know that there is declining dust, particularly even if it doesn't seem so in my house.